Hi everyone, I'm Kate with The Productive Teacher, and I wanted to do this video blog today to talk about a lot of new ideas that are very popular in school districts and schools, maybe in your classroom, and how they all tie together and really how you can use what we are learning about how the brain works to help your students learn better, learn deeper, remember more of what you're teaching them. So if you are in a school that has started pushing growth mindset or SEL, social emotional learning, you are not alone. This is happening all over the country because finally people are realizing that we have to do more than just teach our students academics. Knowing how to read, knowing how to do math are not enough to be successful in this world today. And so we're really focusing on developing them as a whole person and using all of the amazing things that we're learning through brain science to help our students be successful. And so that really is the thread that pulls all of this together. It's brain science, learning how our brains work and using what we learn to make our lives better. So we're gonna start out here with the basic idea that our brains have evolved to help us survive. That's it. People whose, in history, people whose brains helped them survive, they were able to have children and their children were like them. And that process over millions of years, not millions of years for Homo sapiens, over thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, have led to the brains that we are all carrying around in our head right now. Because our brains have evolved to survive, they don't always make the best choices in places like classrooms. Because we have the limbic system, which is in the very center of our brain, and it processes our emotions, and it has this little tiny part called the amygdala that is obsessed with keeping us safe. And safe to the amygdala means, number one, not having any threats, and number two, belonging to a community. Because most of human history meant being safe is being in the community. You couldn't survive on your own. You have to be accepted by the people around you. So all the information that comes into our brains through what we see, what we hear, what we taste, smell, feel, all of that goes through the amygdala first. And if the amygdala senses a threat, it sends a signal to other parts of your brain, other parts of your body to trigger the fight or flight response. And that means that we are getting ready to either fight what we are seeing or run away from it. The fight or flight response releases adrenaline into our bloodstream, which makes our heart beat faster. It shuts down our digestive system. It pumps blood to our arms and legs so that we are ready to move. And the thing about the fight or flight response is it happens even before we are aware that it's happening. So if you've ever been in a stressful situation and all of a sudden your hands feel clammy, your heart's beating fast, maybe you have a little bit of a tummy ache, that is the fight or flight response has started because your amygdala senses a threat. If the amygdala gets information that it doesn't see as a threat, then it passes that information on to the prefrontal cortex, which is where our thinking, as we think of it, happens. The amygdala eventually sends all information to the prefrontal cortex, but there's a delay when it starts the fight or flight response. So that's a lot of social emotional learning, encourages students to take deep breaths and pause and meditate. That's all about training your amygdala to send information to your prefrontal cortex faster, or give yourself time for that information to get to the prefrontal cortex so you can make a better decision about what to do. So safety, I'm sorry, I just keep referring to my notes. So let's talk about safety, because as you can see, safety is the only thing our brains care about. If we don't feel safe, we can't do anything. And that includes your classroom. If your students don't feel safe in your classroom, they are not ready to learn and they're not gonna do their best. They can't. Their brains literally won't let them. So you have to, your number one job is to make your classroom feel safe for your students. And there's a really good book that I read recently called The Culture Code that talks about concrete things you can do to make people feel safe in groups, including your student group. And that is through signaling. So we are constantly signaling each other with our words, with our nonverbal cues, to say either you belong or you don't belong. And when we are aware of this fact, we can make sure that we signal students that they belong in our classroom by the words we say, by how much we smile at them, by how much we touch them in appropriate ways. There was a study many years ago where they gave some university students rats, and they were supposed to teach rats how to run a maze. And they told one group that they were the control group, they had regular rats. And they told another group that they were the experimental group, and they had these special rats who had been bred to be smarter than other rats. And then they had the rats run the maze and did the timing. And it turns out that the experimental rats, the special rats, did run the maze faster. But it turns out there's no such thing as special rats unless you are a fan of Miss Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. They were all just regular rats. The rats weren't the subject of the experiments, the students were. The reason that the rats who were labeled special ran the maze faster was that the students who were training them touched them more, gave them more positive feedback, basically were constantly signaling to the rats that they could run these mazes. And our students are like the rats in that they do better when they believe that we believe in them. So being at your door to welcome students in the morning and welcome them by name, maybe give them a pat on the shoulder. That's one way that you can signal that they belong. Having students' names up in the classroom is another way you can signal that they belong. Having pictures of students up in the classroom is another way to signal that they belong. Whenever you give them feedback, and I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but whenever you give them feedback, let them know why you're giving them that feedback. Let them know, I'm giving you this because I know you can improve. And that will signal to them that they belong and that they are safe to make an effort. Okay, so we need to feel safe in our classroom is the number one thing. If you can change anything in your classroom, make sure students feel safe and you will see results. But schools are also embarking on a lot of social emotional learning. And I know teachers in classrooms are feeling overwhelmed because it's one more thing to teach. You probably didn't learn very much about it in your teaching program if you've been teaching for a while, because it is relatively new in coming to schools. It's not new in the research that's been done, but it does take a while for things to get from the lab to the classroom. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by that, I totally understand. Let's talk through what some of the most important aspects of it are. The number one is teaching kids about their brains and teaching them what we have learned new about the brains. I know when I was growing up, we thought that you didn't grow any new neurons, and we found out that that's not true. We thought that people had fixed intelligences. Now we know that's not true. So really teaching kids that they change their brains. What they do, what they think changes their brains. And you definitely want to introduce them to the amygdala. It's always nice to have a villain when bad things happen. So when they react without thinking or make a mistake, they can always blame their amygdala. Say, "Whoa, my amygdala really took off there. Next time I'll make it better." So those are the really important things that you want them to know. The breathing is something that I know is a big part of a lot of schools' social emotional learning. And I have heard feedback from teachers in my own children's school that it feels fuzzy. Why are we teaching kids to do these things? It feels silly. If you are someone who's not interested in yoga or meditation, you definitely are wondering why you're giving up classroom to teach students breathing exercises. Here's why we need to teach them. Number one, the amygdala will send information, even threatening information, to the prefrontal cortex, but it takes time. So if students can recognize that they are feeling threatened, maybe they notice that their heart is beating faster, maybe they notice they're breathing shallower, they get a little shaky from the adrenaline, taking those deep breaths to calm down gives time to get that information to your prefrontal cortex. So you can think, oh, it's a math test, I'm not gonna die, I'm not really in danger, and calm down that way. Also, our brain uses a lot of oxygen and energy, which the reason we need oxygen is to make energy in our cells using aerobic respiration. So because your brain needs so much energy, it also needs a lot of oxygen. So breathing deeply gets more oxygen to your brain, and so your brain can work better. So those are the reasons that we want to teach that deep breathing. We also want to teach students about our brain, how connections are made in our brain. So when we learn things, do students know how it changes our brains? That we have neurons in our brain that have dendrites that come out of the axons and connect to other neurons, and information moving from neuron to neuron is how we think. It's how we store information. This might be something new if you haven't really thought about it. Neurons don't hold information. So you don't have a neuron that knows this fact and a neuron that knows this fact. All the information in our brain is stored in the connections, in the neural networks. So that's kind of cool to think about, and that every time we revisit information, those connections get stronger. Like a path in the woods is a good way to think about it. You keep going down that same path and it's going to get worn down and worn down. Eventually, it's going to become like a highway, and that's when things become automatic and we don't have to think about them anymore, which is very helpful for when you are working with that information. It's also important to know that when we learn new information, we learn it better when we connect it to what we already know. So adding a little piece onto an existing neural network is much easier, possible, instead of creating an entirely new neural network, which is, if not impossible, very, very difficult to do. So all of that social emotional learning is just learning about our brains, because all of our emotions are in our nervous system, mostly our brains, but all over our body too. And so, yeah, learning about our emotions is learning about our brains. And the more we know about it, the more in control we feel, the more empowered we feel to take steps, make changes in order to conquer them, to be in charge, which is why we would learn it. Okay. Oh, and I missed this part from before. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is definitely true, and the brain science supports that in order to learn, your students have to have their basic needs met. This isn't new to teachers, but don't feel frustrated if you can't teach your students long division if they don't have enough to eat. It's not possible. You can't jump up on the pyramid. So remind yourself, organize your classroom in a way that meets those needs that they have lower on the pyramid before you attempt to jump higher on the pyramid. You'll frustrate yourself, you'll frustrate your students, you'll make your students feel unsafe because they want to be good, they want to please you, but when they can't, then they get frustrated and they make choices that make no sense to us, but is their brain's way of feeling safe. So whenever you are feeling frustrated with a student, with a situation, try to look back and see, is there a rung on the pyramid or a step on the pyramid that is not being met? And hopefully that will give you some new ways to cope with students and meet their needs as best you can so that you can teach them what they need to know. So social emotional learning, that's important too. That's the most important. But what about teaching content? So we are also learning about how we learn best, how our brains work, is that we remember stories way better than we remember anything else. Why do we remember stories way better than we remember everything else? Because stories helped us survive. It all comes back to survival when we're dealing with the brain. So for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, we survived because we listened to each other's stories. And our brains are wired to engage in stories. So when someone is telling you a story, your brains sync up and you are experiencing what is happening in the story at the same time. Our brains are really well developed to empathize with other people, to connect with other people. We have these things called mirror neurons. We have them, and chimpanzees have them, where if we see someone doing something, we will subconsciously do the same thing or feel the same thing. So if you see, for example, someone hitting a tennis ball really hard, especially if you play tennis, you can actually feel that in your hand, in your arm, just by watching them. And that's because of your mirror neurons. And your mirror neurons, I think, it would make sense, are active when someone's telling a story too. So you're putting yourself in that person's shoes to experience what they were experiencing in the story so you can learn it. So as much as you can incorporate stories into your classroom, do it, because your kids are gonna learn better, faster. The other way we get students to learn curriculum content better is by teaching the growth mindset that has been so popular lately. And I know growth mindset has been popular in that teachers have been putting posters up about a growth mindset. They've been talking to their students about what a growth mindset sounds like versus a fixed mindset. It's all good. It's all an improvement over what we had before. But growth mindset can't stop with posters in your classroom. You have to integrate a growth mindset into literally everything you teach. Students have to hear over and over and over again and see over and over and over again that when they put in effort, they get results. And the more effort they put in, the better the results they get. A growth mindset is the belief that we can do anything if we put our minds to it. And there are so many opportunities throughout the day in a classroom to show your students that. So you will want to give them lots of examples of people who have a growth mindset. In history, in science, in whatever you're teaching, there are examples of people with growth mindset. People who didn't accept what the world said they should do, who worked hard, who were able to accomplish more. You need to point it out when you see them changing. So if you give a spelling test on Monday and then a spelling test on Friday, point out to the students how many more questions or how many more words they spelled correctly. If you're doing multiplication facts, show them how they're progressing. You have to point it out to them. It has to be explicit. They will not notice this on their own if they do not already have a growth mindset. Now, you're going to have kids who come in who have a growth mindset. They take for granted that they can improve through effort. You are also going to have students who have a fixed mindset. Even the kids who perform well in school usually can have a fixed mindset because things have been easy for them. And so when things start to get hard, they don't think, oh, I need to work harder. They think, this was as smart as I was. Third grade was it for me. That was the peak, which is not true. They just need to put in more effort. There was a study that I read about many years ago that talked about why boys do better in math in middle school. So up until 4th grade, 5th grade, girls and boys do about the same in math. Girls might even do a little bit better because they have the advantage that it's easier for them to pay attention in school in the earlier grades. They're just more school ready in some ways. And so the girls are doing great in math. It's the boys and the girls are doing great. And then in middle school, the number of girls who consider themselves good at math drops significantly. And so researchers were trying to figure out why this was happening. And if you look at how teachers talk to boys versus how they talk to girls, you can see that they are They are helping the boys build a growth mindset. If I put in effort, I can succeed. And they are helping girls build a fixed mindset. Wow, you did so good at this. Wow, you knew all the answers. Wow, you're doing so great. So just that subtle difference in how you praise them made a huge difference when it came to middle school math. Speaking of math and math tests, any test really, tests are not your enemy. In fact, they are your best friend as a teacher. This is new. This was new to me. I just have been reading a few books on it. Tests are the best way to help your students remember information. Because if we want to remember something, we have to practice remembering it, which is what tests force us to do. So when I was growing up, even in college, if I wanted to study for a test, I would highlight the textbook maybe, I would reread my notes, and that was about it. Turns out, terrible way to study. That is the only worst thing you could do really is nothing at all, because you are not strengthening your neural connections nearly enough just by doing that. Because on the test, you're going to have to remember things. Rereading, highlighting does not force you to remember them. So if you want students to remember something, force them to remember it. That being said, tests are not a summative evaluation of what students know. It's a measurement of what they know in the moment. So use tests to help students remember things and tell them that. Say, we're taking this test because when you take a test, you remember something better. And you can have a series of quizzes or small tests or other activities, I'll tell you in a second, as practice and lead up to a summative test, for sure. But if you only give summative tests in your classroom, then students are getting the idea that these tests are measurements of them. It feeds into a fixed mindset that if I get this grade on a test, that's how smart I am. Instead, let them see tests as a tool to help them remember something. Because the goal is never to get a high grade on a test. I shouldn't say that. Sometimes the goal is to get a high grade on a test. But the purpose of all of this is to function in the world, to do a job, to make the world better. And the test is just a tool in getting to that goal. So let's always keep that in our mind. Okay, so other things besides tests you can do to help students remember things. Number one, teach them something through lecture, through video, through a reading passage, and then when it's all put away, ask them what they just learned. If you have a reading passage with questions, instead of giving them to the students at the same time, give them the reading passage, let them know they will be asked questions about it, put the reading passage away, take out the questions, and have them try. This is going to be very frustrating for your students, especially your high achievers who are used to getting all the answers right and being able to look up the answer. They are not going to like the discomfort that comes with not remembering the answer sometimes. That's what learning is. Learning is hard. Anybody who tells you that learning is easy is selling you something, because learning is not easy. It is hard. It should be hard. The harder it is when we learn, the better we learn. So you always want to remind your students of this, remind them that what they are doing is hard, that you believe in them, that they can do it, and you're here to support them. One other thing, along with this retrieving information after you teach something, you can definitely help prime students' brains to learn something new by having them make predictions before you teach them. This is kind of like the KWL chart that's priming your brain to learn something new. You can do that chart. You can also do the simple activity of give them a problem. For example, in a math class, before you teach them the lesson for the day, give them an example problem and have them try to solve it. Use what they already know to figure out a new problem. This primes their brain because it pulls forward all of those neural networks that they have in place to put more information into, and they will learn better. Even if they make mistakes, even if they don't get the right answer, they learn better with that predicting. Circling back to feedback on tests. Remember I said signaling, you want to signal that students belong by explaining why you're giving them feedback. Don't write the grade of a test at the top of a test. If you do, that is the only thing your students will look at. They will not look through at any of your other feedback on the test. I'm not saying you don't grade it, that's fine. Put the grade somewhere else for students to look at your feedback. And whenever you can, make the note that the feedback is because you want them to be better and you know they can be. There was another study where teachers who were working on a writing assignment wrote feedback to the students, and some of them, before the feedback, on the top of it they wrote, "I'm giving you this feedback because I have very high expectations and I know you can meet them." And then they gave the feedback, and the students who got that extra note with the feedback were more likely to go back and revise their paper more time, and they ended up getting higher grades on the paper. So just those small interventions can make a big difference to your students. Let's see. Oh, okay. Just a couple more things. So all of this advice that I have been giving you about teaching academics really focuses on knowledge, of learning facts and information and remembering them. And I know that there is always a fight between teaching knowledge and creating creative thinkers. What a lot of teachers, myself included before, felt my kids don't need to know these facts. They need to be able to think creatively to solve problems. The problem with that is you have to have the information, the facts, the knowledge at your fingertips to think creatively with it. You can't look it up on Google and then think creatively. It's too hard. You have to have strong neural connections for the information in order to work with it. So if you want your students to be able to think creatively, teach them information that they can think creatively with. Okay, now last couple things. Number one, I have said it many times in this video, learning is hard work. Whether you're doing social emotional learning, whether you're learning your times tables, learning is hard. Admit this to your students. Help them see that they are working hard for a purpose, that it is worth the effort, and then show them how they improve through that effort. But also take breaks. I know as teachers you don't have control over how much recess your students get. They really should have at least 3 recesses a day, maybe even more depending on their age. In Finland, they're very famous for teaching students for 45 minutes, sending them out to play for 15 minutes. For many other reasons too, Finland has one of the strongest educational systems in the world. It's not just the recess thing, but isn't it worth a try? Our brains are like a muscle. They can't work all the time. They are working all the time, but they can't focus all the time. They need breaks. They need time for fun and play, and they need time to process information. This is something I forgot to tell you before. We learn best when we learn something. Take a break, ideally overnight, so we have time to sleep, and then come back and learn it again. Take a break, learn it again. Because in between each of these sessions, we forget it a little bit. And when we remember it, it strengthens that neural connection even more. So if there's information that you absolutely want your students to have, spread it out over a long period of time and they will remember it better. Okay. So taking breaks, recess is important. If you can't give your students more recess, build those breaks into the classroom. Let them talk to each other. We are social creatures. We have evolved to be social, to talk to each other. So let them do that. And then if you're talking to your students, even adults can only pay attention for 7 to 10 minutes before we can't pay attention anymore. It's like holding up a heavy weight. You can hold it up for a while, but eventually you're gonna have to drop it. That's like what our attention is. So don't try to talk to your students for longer than that. Have them do interactive things, talk to them, tell them one thing, have them work with it, take a break, come back and tell them another thing. Last thing, take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. The most important person that you need to take care of in your classroom is yourself. You cannot help your students if you are worn out. So please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Take sick days when you are sick. Take mental health days when you need a break. Eat well, drink water, and exercise. I know that after a long day, the last thing you want to do is exercise, but you will feel so much better, and your brain works better when you exercise. It's another way we evolved, because when we were running on the plains away from animals, we had to think while we were running. So even now today, we think best while we are running or after we have exercised. So all good things from exercising. But get rest, be kind to yourself. We are all human. We're gonna make mistakes, and that's okay, because we have a growth mindset too. That's why we're able to teach it to our students. So that was a lot of information today. This was a long video, but I wanted to kind of download everything I've been thinking in one place. 30 minutes, that's not bad. You hopefully even watched me on double speed, so that is like 15 minutes. And check back with me at The Productive Teacher. I've got lots more ideas to share with you. Things I have that will make your life easier right now. I am about to upload some social emotional learning conversation starters. So this is where I share some of the science with pictures that you can either share printed out or up on your projector with your students to get them thinking about their brains, about how it works, their emotions, everything we talked about. I also have reading passages that all have questions attached. When I made them, I'll be honest, I thought about using them the way I had always used reading passages, where students fill out the questions as they read. What I know now is give them the reading passage, then give them the question. And I am also working, it's not ready yet, but on a math program for a growth mindset, because I think that that is an area that most kids struggle with, understanding that effort equals growth. And so I'm really excited that that will be coming soon too. You can follow me on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. You can join my newsletter group on my website. I hope to hear from you all soon.